you're leaving the comfort of having one homeroom teacher and having play dates arranged by your parents to suddenly having to navigate it on your own. No one's making sure you have a buddy on the bus, and the work is more difficult. And there's this sense that somehow it has greater significance.
Navigating the choppy waters of middle school is a journey filled with challenges and discoveries. What makes this age so unique in a person's development? How do the superpowers that tweens possess influence their path through these crucial years? Our guest today, Phyllis Fagell, is back with us, armed with her wisdom from her latest book, Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens Through Turbulent Times. All of this and more straight ahead on episode 196. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
If you follow me on social media, you've seen me post about my recent keynotes and training for conferences, corporations, and schools. I'm in the process of booking out my spring and summer calendar for speaking and training engagements. So if your organization is looking for ways to better support neurodivergent employees, accommodate a neurodiverse school, or empower parents of neurodivergent children, please get in touch. I would love to work with your organization, either virtually or in person. Just go to neurodiversitypodcast.com and fill out the form on the Contact Us page, and we will get back to you right away. Okay, Phyllis Fagell is up next.
previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
That kind of liberal education model where you get to learn a little bit about everything and where you get to have freedom to choose the things that are of interest to you, neurodiverse people, that's where they would thrive. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly how our education system used to be, right? Like the highest thing was that you were a Renaissance man, let's say, someone who does dabble in everything a little bit, but we've moved so far away from that now. We feel like narrowing everything down is doing a service. It's sort of helping people prepare. The truth is that even after college, in order for neurodiverse people to feel successful and functional, they can't be in environments where it's too narrow because that just doesn't match their thinking.
That's episode 170. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, I'm welcoming Phyllis Fagell back to the podcast. Phyllis is a school counselor and therapist and an author. Her latest book is called Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens Through Turbulent Times. So Phyllis, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me back.
You and I have spoken before, and I think a lot of folks are a little uncertain about what to think about us when they find out that we both love working with and supporting tweens. I think most people kind of go back to their own experiences. What is it about this age in particular that makes you love it so much?
I call it the last best opportunity, and that's not because it's the last opportunity. We can influence our children throughout their lives, but this is a time when they are sophisticated and savvy and able to take in really complex information and understand what our values are and what is important to us. And it's an opportunity for them to think about what's important to them. And they still really care what adults think. They want to please the adults. Even if it looks like they're not listening at all, they're taking it all in. And at the same time, there's that childlike innocence still in them. So they're funny and endearing, and they don't take things too seriously. If you want to lighten the mood, they're the best age to hang around. And it's that combination that makes the age so interesting and such a good opportunity to coach them.
Yeah. They're independent in a lot of ways, but also they're just really trying to figure that all out during that window of time. As a teacher, definitely the most fun group that I ever had the opportunity to work with, but also you never knew what you were going to get from day to day. It was always something different.
It's so true. And there's such a huge variation from sixth grade to eighth grade. And sixth, seventh, and eighth each have such a distinct overall personality. And yet within each of those grades, you can have one kid who's playing with Barbies and another one who is really interested in where everyone ranks in terms of popularity and is more sophisticated. And that makes it really challenging socially for the kids and for the teachers as well, but also really interesting.
I know for me, middle school was not great. I think a lot of people would agree. I'm curious about what your middle school experience was like.
I had to really dig deep to even remember much about it. I was going through some papers this past summer and found the class photo of my graduating class at Frank A. Day Junior High School in Newton, Massachusetts. There were about 450 students in my class. And suddenly I had this flood of memories, one of which was feeling completely overwhelmed. I remember being afraid I would get lost from one class to the next. I remember getting demoted from advanced math to regular math. And I remember going to the school counselor because they were about to tell me that I had been demoted. And I'm sure they didn't use that language. And I could see that the school counselor was prepared to console me or reassure me. And all I remember feeling was extreme relief. I was so glad not to be over my head in yet another area because just being that age was so overwhelming. Navigating things like Halloween parties and who is going to dress up in the same costumes and all of those social challenges that seem so huge at that age. Though I will say, I don't think that your middle school experiences are necessarily worse than other times in your life. It's just that you went through middle school at the same time that you were going through puberty. You were experiencing every emotion on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 10 or 110 if you were to ask a middle schooler. And you have no way of knowing that things are going to turn out okay because for many of these setbacks, it's the very first time you've experienced them.
That actually kind of brings me to my next question, which is recognizing that tweens really are at this stage of identity formation and independence building. So they really are kind of at this crossroads as far as what makes this transition at this age different than other transitions in life, like starting college or entering a career. It sounds like you notice specifically not having that life experience behind you to kind of pull from as a resource is one factor. But what else would you add to that?
Some of it is that it coincides with when many kids suddenly have a phone in their pocket and they can socialize all day long. So the social demands on their time are increasing at the same time as a phase when they're really acutely aware of where they stack up socially in comparison to others. So it's in sharp relief, and you're maybe reeling from losing a friend in elementary school because of that maturity gap that I was talking about as interests diverge. It's a phase when there's so much more social churn than there are at other phases in kids' lives. So there can be a sense of loss. There's also that melancholiness that can set in because you're leaving childhood behind and you're leaving the comfort of having one homeroom teacher and having play dates arranged by your parents to suddenly having to navigate it on your own. No one's making sure you have a buddy on the bus, and the work is more difficult. And there's this sense that somehow it has greater significance in terms of your long-term trajectory. I have to reassure middle schoolers all the time that 1B+, and these days a B+ is like a failing grade for many kids, especially in the high pressure area where I live, that 1B+ isn't going to derail their success in life or their chances of going to the high school they want to go to if they're applying to a magnet program or an independent school. So there's this weightiness that sets in that suddenly all of these things that were safe to fail at before suddenly don't feel as safe.
How do you think adults approach supporting tweens? Do you feel like most people do it effectively? Like what influences that? And as far as self-reflection goes, what can we kind of look at within ourselves about how we're supporting the tweens in our lives?
You know, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about parenting a kid through this transition, and you can go too far in either direction. You can hover too much and impede their independence, which is so important to them, Or you can go in the other direction and say, well, it looks like they're not that interested in my being involved. I'm just going to take a step back and stay out of their way. And frankly, I don't really remember loving this phase myself and just hope it goes by quickly. And kids in this age group need a ton of concrete help, even with things like social skills, how to enter a conversation, or academic skills, how to get organized. There's this assumption that kids are lazy when they're not doing their work, when in fact they are in a stage of brain development where they don't yet have the ability to fully understand how to stay organized or what impact not doing their work today is going to have on the product they produce tomorrow. And also research shows that if they think the stakes are high, unlike an older adolescent or an adult, they don't actually perform better. It doesn't have the same effect on them. So we might double down and really try to impress upon them how important something is and be frustrated when they don't seem to rise to the occasion. And that might actually be counterproductive.
Well, I think we can all recognize that occasionally a healthy dose of anxiety is good, but it sounds like for this age group, sometimes it can backfire, like they'll shut down as opposed to push through it.
It can show up in all kinds of ways. They can become perfectionists. They can opt out. They might skip a class entirely if they think they won't do well in that particular setting. They might pretend they don't care. They might cheat. There's all kinds of ways that that can manifest. And it doesn't necessarily feel intuitive, but when we set kids up for success, we actually get more success. And when we lower the stakes, we get more success because they're more willing to take those risks and they're more likely to acquire all of those skills and habits that they need, not only in 7th or 8th grade, but also later on when the stakes do become a bit higher.
In the neurodiversity community, we frequently talk about camouflaging and masking, that kids kind of try to hide their traits of neurodivergence in order to fit in. And I think especially at that middle school age, that's around the age when they start becoming more aware of what fits and what doesn't, what's normal and what's weird. And I would say, of course, even just beyond neurodivergent kids, I think all kids are kind of going through that piece of it as they enter that phase. How do you find that pressure to camouflage or mask influencing kids during the middle school years?
I think it's hardest for the kids who can't mask it as much as they want to. And on the other hand, they're forced to figure out how to explain, what makes them tick and how they operate maybe at a younger age than others, which probably is helpful in terms of them accepting their own idiosyncrasies or their own learning challenges. For others, I think it can get in the way of their ability to connect with peers. And middle schoolers are the first to sniff out inauthenticity, and they know each other better than they think they know one another. As much as they are focused on themselves, they do have a good sense of the kids around them. And if somebody's twisting themselves into a pretzel to pretend to be something they're not, or trying to mask that something is difficult for them, it can really get in their way socially. And I always share with kids research showing that the beautiful mess effect, kids actually hold people in higher esteem and have more respect for them if they're willing to admit that they struggle in some ways. So it does tend to backfire, and it's a lot of stress. It's like preserving a lie and remembering the story. It's a relief to share that kind of personal information about yourself. Of course, you want to be sure you're in a safe environment to do that. But most of the time, kids, especially middle schoolers, will bend over backwards to support somebody who admits a weakness and probably confess one of their own.
I agree with that. I'm frequently advocating for strengths-based supports in general, and your idea of superpowers really aligns with that. So how did you come up with the specific superpowers that you felt like really fit with this stage of life?
After I wrote Middle School Matters, my first book, I thought I was done. That was supposed to be the what to expect when you're expecting a middle schooler. And I set that aside and went back to my K-8 working with students. And then, of course, 6 or 8 months later, the pandemic hit and everything shut down. I had a 6th grader at the time, so I was living it on all fronts. And suddenly we had this situation where the strategies that I had outlined in Middle School Matters, while they were great strategies, it didn't cover the full gamut of what kids needed, especially when they returned to school. These were kids who had had prolonged isolation and who had taken a hit to their social skills, who were used to having a lot more freedom and agency. So when kids came back, they were not the same kids that I had seen when I had been in the building before. And in my school, we came back fairly quickly. So other kids were even more impacted by that isolation, by the time they had at home, more opportunities to self-direct their schedule, fewer people telling them what to do and when, because a lot of parents were trying to work or weren't even in the home while their kids were doing their work. And I found myself paying attention to the strategies that worked for these kids. So some of them were lying on their chair like Superman with their arms in front of them and behind them. And if you didn't really know what was going on, you might think they were trying to make people laugh or they were being rude, but they really were trying to stay grounded in their bodies. It was very hard for them to stay grounded all day in the school setting. And then we had kids who maybe hadn't paid much attention when they were home. They hadn't kept up with the workload. And when they came back, they were even more self-conscious than a middle schooler is typically, and were more avoidant. I had one student who didn't want to come back at all because he had gained some weight and he was afraid that friends would tease him. And it just showed up in all kinds of ways, more perfectionism, more anxiety, all of the things that we read about in all of the alarming posts about kids' mental health. And over time, it became clear that there were several areas where kids needed more support. And the kids who were doing better than the others, and they were all what I called extreme tweens. That was the phrase I coined because they were the same middle schoolers, only more so. But the kids who were doing better had certain strengths. And those are the 12 superpowers that I talk about in Middle School Superpowers. And while they're strengths that are important for kids of any age, they really align with this developmental phase. So super daring is about taking risks, and there is no harder time to take risks than when you are as insecure as a middle schooler. There's super belonging, and this is because knowing where your place is socially at an age when friendships are everything makes that such a foundational superpower. Super bounce. Every middle schooler is making mistakes. This is about coming back from those mistakes and recovering from disappointment. Along the same line, super optimism. These kids are not growing up in the same kind of climate as kids have in past generations. Even 10 years ago, my older two had a very, very different middle school experience than my youngest. Even things like school shootings have really impacted how kids experience school. And now we had Ukraine, but now we have everything going on in the Middle East. We've got climate crises, and especially, I know you do a lot of work with gifted kids, but the ones who personalize and have a hard time setting aside these big existential worries in particular, we're struggling. And the list goes on. There's 12 of them, but they relate to where kids are developmentally.
Yeah, I like that. And recognizing that they really are primed to build these skills and use them as strengths. They really are in a good place to be able to develop that, not only to help them in the immediate term, but also as they go forward and develop and mature into high school and college and adulthood.
Yes, and they're very teachable.
Yeah.
Even resilience itself is a teachable set of skills. I think a lot of people think it's something you either are or you're not. And just dispelling that myth alone was something I realized was important. And even helping adults bolster their own optimism. One of the studies that I was really drawn to was one that showed that most kids after trauma experience what's called post-traumatic growth. They actually are stronger for their struggles. And there's no time in life when you're experiencing as many challenges and having to adjust to so many changes as in the tween years. So if we can teach them these skills now, we will have particularly resilient adults.
It reminds me of just recently my daughter, who's in 8th grade. This is an analogy, so not exactly the same, but she had a hoverboard accident.
Oh.
She was texting and hoverboarding, so no ADHD there at all, but she broke her arm really badly, and we had to take an ambulance ride and, down at St. Louis Children's Hospital and everything, and they were going to go in and do surgery. And we went in the day before the surgery was going to happen, and they looked at the x-rays, and they were like, well, let's give it a week and look at it again. And I'm looking at the exercise. I'm like, that does not look like it's going to heal the right way, but okay. And they just basically, we kind of kept going in and checking. And they're like, when kids are young like this, the bones just like grow back together. We really don't have to go in and fix it too much because their bodies are just so much more resilient. And I feel like that's a physical difference, but it is kind of the same where even emotionally and socially, kids have this ability to adapt. It's kind of that neuroplasticity. Like it's just so evolving at that point that nothing's set in stone. It can really develop.
That's a great analogy. And it makes me think about the classic parenting challenge where your kid dumps something really upsetting on you. Somebody said something that was hurtful, or they weren't invited to something, or teacher didn't call on them for the 10th day in a row, and it must be because the teacher hates them. And you're then carrying it around. And when they come home from school, you say, did that thing happen again? Or was that person nice to you? And they're like, what are you talking about? They've completely moved on and let it go.
Yeah. It's like the Ted Lasso saying, be a goldfish.
Yes.
Which we actually used that with our younger son, who has not watched Ted Lasso because that would not be developmentally appropriate. He's only 8 years old, but he has this perfectionism that gets him to shut down. And we're like, be a goldfish. If you make a mistake, just kind of forget about it and go on. But kids are better at that. We really do hold on to that. And sometimes that's probably a reaction to some of our own past experiences where we've been hurt. But that not having the life experience behind you in some ways is harder because you don't have that to lean on to go, okay, I got through this before. But also, it's not a detriment. It's not going to hold you back with any of those negative emotions that are associated with it.
That's right. It only holds you back if you don't let it go.
Yeah.
If you're not the goldfish.
I imagine that one of the hardest things about supporting tweens is helping them realize that they have all of these skills. So how is it that you really help kids recognize these strengths in themselves and put them to use?
They're definitely not going to see them in themselves. So it's incumbent on us to point out their strengths when we see them and then repeat it. Every time you see them exercising a particular strength, whether they're kind to somebody, whether they remembered something that they had had trouble remembering the week before, really noticing any kind of incremental improvement. I think for middle schoolers, this sense that somehow you're supposed to be able to do everything perfectly right away is so pervasive, and they can give up easily if they don't see results. And it doesn't necessarily occur to them that if they get cut from the baseball team, one option is to try something else. Another option is to say, okay, well, what can I do over the winter to get stronger so that I can try out again? That one rejection doesn't have to mean you're cooked and it's all over. And also, what are some positive things that can come out of that experience? And all of these skills and all of these observations are ways that we can support them. You had started by asking, how can parents support middle schoolers? Really making sure that we are highlighting the things they're good at. I think it's very easy to fall into the pattern of focusing on deficits or focusing on things that they didn't do, or a chore they didn't do, or the fact that they didn't remember to hand in a particular permission slip, or they're disorganized. The list goes on. They left their water bottle at school. It can be anything because they are so disorganized at this age, and it can be frustrating and infuriating. And I get it. I probably see 75 water bottles at the front of this school at any given time, but they're all the same. And nobody does better because somebody tells them that they're lacking in some way or the stakes are high.
I understand why parents focus on those things because we go into problem-solving mode, right? And so that's easy to get stuck there a little bit. But if we come at it from this other angle of focusing on those strengths, that's just going to be so much more effective at helping kids to actually build those skills.
And you're modeling how to give a compliment, which is the most underrated social skill, the ability to give a meaningful, substantive compliment. I was at the dentist yesterday, and I was standing out in front of the office, and these two kind of too cool for school, they had to have been maybe 15, 16-year-old boys, were outside, and they were kind of jostling each other, and they were being kind of rude to each other. And all of a sudden, one of the kids turned to the other kid, and he said, "Hey, man, I love your haircut." I think it's a better haircut than mine. And he said it kind of just offhand. And it was almost jarring to the other kid because it was out of nowhere. And then that was the end of the conversation. I think it shocked them both into a bit of silence. And what I saw that next was that the kid who had been complimented, he turned around, he started to walk away. All of a sudden, as soon as he didn't think anyone was watching, had this massive smile on his face. He was so happy just from that one compliment. And it changed the whole mood. It changed the interaction. I'm sure it changed how that second kid felt about the first kid, how he felt about himself. And it kicks off this very positive cycle of reciprocity. And every time we compliment our kid in a meaningful way, we are teaching them modeling how to do that with their friends as well.
That's so important. I mean, kids avoid that because, well, I think adults avoid it too, because it takes a level of vulnerability to give a compliment, which maybe seems kind of counterintuitive, but you're kind of taking a risk a little bit by offering that to somebody, especially for tweens and teens. It's easy to go, that's so cheesy, right? But it is a skill, and it is really valuable in building those relationships.
And you have to teach it very explicitly. So when I do a compliment activity with middle schoolers to teach them how to give a real compliment, not a meaningless compliment. And I say to them, what's a more meaningful compliment? If someone tells you they like your water flask, or if somebody tells you that they think you have a really cool sense of style and they love how you dress every day. And the kids get that right away. And then I ask them, if you have 5 people compliment you on your soccer skills and someone else comes along and compliments you on your soccer skills, is that more or less meaningful than if that 6th person comes along and compliments you for being a really good listener? And what I'm trying to convey is that it's important to be a good observer, to really see things in people that are positive. I think it's very easy for kids, especially socially, to fixate on the negative or to fixate on what they're not getting from a relationship. We want them to understand that different people contribute different things and have different gifts and different strengths, as do they. And no one person can fulfill all their needs. And you will be happier if you focus on the people who are contributing to your happiness rather than the people who are stealing your joy.
Yeah, totally. So Phyllis, I know we could talk all day, but this brings me to our last question. I'm wondering if you were able to send your younger middle school age self a message, what is it that you would have wanted to hear at that time? What wisdom do you think would have just helped you have a slightly easier time through those years?
Oh, that's such a good question. I was really shy. I was so shy that I don't think I could even address teachers by name. I would kind of stand near them and hope they would notice that I had a question. I had a lisp as well. And so I didn't speak up as much as I might have because I was self-conscious about the lisp. And I think if I were to go back, I would tell myself that no one was as focused on me as I was on myself, which is so obvious to us as adults and not at all obvious to a middle schooler, and really encourage that former version of myself to take more social risks and more academic risks, and to do it slowly so that I didn't get overwhelmed, but that it didn't have to be all or nothing. I think I opted out of a lot of things rather than just kind of give it a try and move at a comfortable pace.
Phyllis Fagell, author of Middle School Superpowers. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Parenting is a process of planned obsolescence. Our main job is to put ourselves out of a job by raising children who are independent and self-sufficient. The tween years are when we really start to begin that gradual release toward independence. Sometimes we may want to hang on a little too tight. Sometimes our kids may try to pull themselves from our embrace. But there's this ebb and flow between childhood and emerging young adulthood that is totally unique to this age. The malleability of the tween age years can't be overlooked, And we can use the strengths or superpowers of our tweens to leverage their abilities and help them grow into the caring and empowered adults that they are meant to be. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thank you to Phyllis Fagell for reminding us what amazing people middle schoolers are and how magical this time can be for them, of course, but also for us as we go shopping for Clearasil. By the way, you can learn more about Phyllis through the links in the show notes. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. And for all of us, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.